I'll now hand back to you, Brigitte.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, everyone. Well, I hope today that we can finish the approvals of the Stage 2 chapters so that they can go forward for notification on the 2nd of May. We're also looking to approve all of the officers' comments with the amendments from last week and what we need to still go through further today so that we've finished covering them all. So the documents that we need to be focusing on again are the spiral-bound Minister's Comments table, and there is the very short table that looks the same that was also circulated with some amendments in it to the spiral-bound copy. I believe you have been circulated a memo as to what was still remaining to be approved today. So if we go to the top of that list, and this will be in numeric order as we go through the spiral-bound table. So first up, we have Alison just finishing off the temporary activities table. I would note that there are two matters that will go through to Friday because they're better heard in relation to the Central City chapter, which will come to you on Friday.
Right.
And one of those is the sale of alcohol rule that we questioned last week, you might recall. Yep. We will bring that to you on Friday specifically. I'm
actually pleased about that because we deferred the consideration of the local alcohol plan for a number of reasons. Not the least of which was the late notification, so it came through as a late paper. But the feedback from ministers on this issue has raised for me alarm bells because the previous council absolutely determined the local alcohol plan on the basis that this provision would be dealt with in the district plan. That's right. And I'm now deeply concerned that if we leave the local alcohol plan the way it is and the independent hearings panel were to prefer the view of the ministers, then we are actually stuck without any protection around this issue. So this is the advice that I want to take between now and Friday, because I think that we need you guys as the district plan team to work very closely with the local alcohol plan team in order to come up with some shared advice, because it may well be that we'll have to completely start the local alcohol plan process again on the basis that we can't rely on the district plan for a very basic rule that actually every city would expect to have by way of distance, a buffer between venues that sell alcohol and residential properties. So I think it's a significant issue, and it's probably better that it's arisen now in the time frame that we have to actually readdress it in the alcohol plan if we have to. Right. Yeah.
We've invited the policy lead for the local alcohol policy to come on Friday as well, so be able to speak to the overlap between those issues.
That would be really good if the team could come as well. Yeah. That would be brilliant.
We're also getting some legal advice for you as well.
Excellent, thank you.
So that leaves just one rule for Alison to go over, and I'll hand over to Alison.
So this is on page 41, which is recommendation number 7 around the notification requirements for fences and impervious surfaces in the water body setbacks. And there was a question in terms of whether or not it was appropriate to remove the notification requirements. In light of the discussion that we had last week, I'm suggesting a recommendation or an amendment to the recommendation. So I've distributed that before the meeting. You should find it on your desk.
So this is this one here?
Yeah, so this is the one with the...
Okay, let's go through this.
Okay. So the original proposal was to remove written approval and notification requirements for all classifications of water bodies. What I'm suggesting instead is to remove them only for water bodies where the primary matter of discretion is natural hazards, because I think the assessment of natural hazards is generally a technical decision, which requires flood modeling and extensive engineering understanding. So I think in those circumstances that it's potentially not necessary to have notification, whereas for types of waterways where we're assessing the amenity effects, that it is beneficial to have that notification process, and that significant input into the decision-making process can arise from that notification process. So what I'm recommending is to remove it for the network and hill waterways, because the primary concern there is the flooding and natural hazards issues, but to retain it for higher orders of waterways, so downstream, upstream, and environmental asset waterways, where amenity is one of the effects that's considered.
Yep, that sounds reasonable. Any questions?
I don't know where to start. We had a pretty good discussion last time.
Mm-hmm.
The thing I'm still struggling to understand is the risk of removing this requirement for notification versus the benefit.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a shame Paul's not here. We're dealing with cases in the hills where people have got things on the boundary where water runs off,
mm-hmm.
and it's causing all sorts of problems. So I would have thought that people should have a right to be notified where something's going to impact on them, particularly around water. Like, I just think it's, so I just can't see. You still have the discretion when you get the resource consent application to determine if it's going to be really major effects on someone or whether it's going to be no more than minor, and you can do the notification that way. So I don't understand why we would remove that requirement, because it should safeguard us against those really bad cases that a number of us get where people are really upset that they haven't been informed, and they end up having a situation that is really unsatisfactory.
Well, under the Fencing Act, when there's a proposal to fence a boundary between two properties, there's a requirement for one neighbor to notify the other neighbor, and that neighbor has 21 days to object to that proposal. So that provision acts in some way as notification. So in most situations, you wouldn't have one neighbor being completely blindsided by the decision to develop along a property boundary.
Except what people do on their own property can have a consequence on the waterway, which can then have a further consequence downstream or to people that are in the close proximity. So
where that's a flooding issue, that's why we're requiring consent at this point. And the council would assess what those flooding effects would be. And the point I'm trying to make is that I think council is in the best position to make that assessment, because it requires it's quite a technical assessment that needs to be made. And it's a question of whether or not the neighbor would be able to provide that level of assessment that the council would provide in those situations. But for something like amenity effects, where it's not, it's more of a qualitative decision-making process, in those situations, I think it makes sense to retain the notification requirements.
Yeah. Phil?
Well, mine was, besides the fencing though, like the impervious surfaces. Once, for example, layers of concrete driveway are put down, clearly they can impact on neighbours below the the drainage catchment.
Yeah.
So this takes away their rights though to say this is going to affect my property.
Again, it's because it's a flooding issue, and that's quite a technical assessment that needs to be made in terms of how that impervious surfacing is going to affect flooding across the catchment. I think the same argument holds for impervious surfacing as for fencing, is that most neighbours wouldn't have,
I think what you're experiencing from councillors is that there are examples where the council has approved certain activities to occur, and they have had flow-on, deliberate choice of words, effects to other property owners.
Right.
But what you're saying is that that actually the council ought to be providing really strong technical advice as to whether those flow-on effects will occur. But the trouble that you're having is that it hasn't always protected people.
Right. Yeah. In the operative plan, there's no controls on impervious surfacing in the setbacks. There's no controls on fencing. So these are new rules that are being introduced.
Right. So this should improve the situation from the way it has been in the past,
Absolutely.
where essentially neither fencing nor impervious surfaces were subject to the degree of technical analysis that you're saying that the council will now undertake because the rules were written into the plan.
Right, because now it's triggering a consent for the first time.
Well, it sounds sensible to me, so I don't know what...
It may compare with having nothing, but it's. I just think this, I just would have thought this could have been stronger. Like, for example, we're talking about, I guess, water movement, aren't we? We're not just talking about flooding. And clearly, if people end up with having water running under their house, that's something they should know about in advance. And this
Which
removes
is
it.
why I use the phrase flow-on effects quite deliberately, because I think that what we're hearing is that the current, or the operative plan didn't have notification requirements because they didn't have these provisions. So writing in the provisions, the question is it a technical issue whether there are these flow-on effects? And having not turned their minds to it in the past, we've had disastrous outcomes for some of our people, and I'm afraid the earthquakes have kind of exacerbated that, and our knowledge around it has increased. I reminded myself of a report that was done on the on some of the decisions for developments in liquefaction-prone areas, which should never have gone ahead without the degree of analysis around ground preparation. But that's the way it was. This is a district plan for the way it should be. Yanni?
The way I see this is for probably 90% of the time, people probably won't need to notify, but where you get someone that owns, say you had a lake or a river, right? Think of Hanson's Park, where you've got all those properties that have.
Sorry, I don't know, Hanson. Is that up in the hill?
Rudolf Steiner School, where the Heathcote goes around. Hanson's Park, so it's sort of the Rudolf Steiner School, where you've got the river going around. You've got all those properties that have an interface to that water.
But that's
body.
not up in the hills.
No, it's not. But it's in the water body setback. So what says for network and hill waterways. So I presume that the Heathcote is a network waterway?
No, it's a downstream waterway.
Right, okay.
And the lakes are environmental assets, standing water bodies, so it's not applying to lakes and ponds or to larger rivers. It's only to open drains and to hill waterways where the gradient is over 1 in 50.
Right. So what's an example of one in the city?
Of a drain?
Yeah, like what of a network or a hill waterway?
Network waterway would be. I mean, there's. Say again. Yeah, there's segments along Edgware Road that are network waterways. So it's just whatever is defined as an open drain is a network waterway. So it generally has constructed sides and low ecological value.
I think this is a distinct improvement on the current plan. I'd really rather, move on. I think we've answered questions, so some people obviously agree with it and others don't. So, shall we move to? How do you want to?
Wall like a fortress alongside a waterway, and it gets consent, and the neighbours have no notification, and suddenly you've got.
No, this is about impervious surfacing and fencing standards that don't currently exist in our plan.
So if you don't comply with the fencing standards, you need a consent. Understand that. The question is, if you need to apply for a consent because you don't meet those fencing standards, do the people that are directly affected on each side of you or across from you have any right to be informed and notified and to give their view? And my view is yes.
But it's a technical issue.
No, it's also an amenity issue.
No, it's a technical issue as to whether it will have flow-on effects to other properties. That's the point. So look, I think that we agree that there are some councillors who think that this isn't strong enough. There are other councillors who think that it is. So I'm happy to move that the staff recommendation. Have I got a seconder for that position? Nobody would like to second that position. Right. So I will put that motion. All those in favour say aye. Those opposed say no. So if we could have a show of hands, please. Those in favour of the motion? 5. Those opposed? 3. 5-3. That's carried. Thank you.
Thank you. Now moving on to page 25 in your spiral-bound copy. And we'll now look at specific purpose zone Wigram. And I have with me Ben Baird, who is new to the council, an assistant planner. So this is the first time you will have seen him.
Hey.
Welcome, Ben. Page 25 in the spiral-bound copy.
This is this one. Or that one. I've got little labels on mine.
Officer recommended notification.
Yeah,
Okay, that was on Tuesday.
yeah. All of that box is for Friday. Right. So, what have we got here? We've got draft open space general procedures. Where are we? That's not page 25.
Wigram, specific purpose.
No,
Wigram.
sorry, I'm just looking at what we've got coming up in front of me.
To save a lot of hassle and finding, was just the military component of it that was left in there.
That seemed to allow firearms to be discharged all day and every day, and a military base component left in there.
There is a designation on that area by the Ministry of Defence, which is the purposes for defence purposes
Yes.
outlined in 1990 Defence Act.
So what does it actually mean that can happen there?
They can bring, raise and maintain armed forces for the protection and interests of New Zealand in that area.
So can you just take me through what in practice that could look like in the middle of
I
a
don't know
residential
what the
subdivision?
Ministry of
Well, they
Defence
can
would like
march
to do.
with guns like they did the other day at the big celebration
But-
of the...
It was more than marching with guns. They can actually fire a whole pile of weaponry and things in there, can't they?
Possibly.
Legally.
What
But
we
they
just
can now.
recommended was to use the word defence purposes to recognise the fact that the Ministry of Defence has that designation on the
So
land.
they currently have that designation.
Yeah.
Yes.
But Wigram has now a highly intensified residential subdivision.
Yeah.
Is this just applied to some areas like the old runway, or?
It's just the specific purpose area is the designation area. So the area around the museum, there's kind of vacant land around there, and the old building where they land helicopters and things like that.
Perhaps I could help.
Thanks.
What's left over is the gifted land. The original that was gifted a night for the RNZAF or whatever it was called back then by a lady, or Henry Wigram. And so that the rest of Wigram has gone for development, but that 37 hectares has been left that was original gifted land, and it's basically used. It is designated for defence purposes, but I'm not aware of any firearms practice or anything like that that's happened. The main thing that
I'm not either.
No.
That's why I wasn't keen to encourage
No,
it.
no, it's pretty unlikely. They've got Burnham, they've got West Melton, they've got a whole lot of and Tekapo. They go everywhere to practice their sniper practice, whatever they do. The two usually, as Ben would go to say, is the museum and the helicopter flying. It's basically and the idea show.
My concern was what they do at West Melton being allowed to be done at Wigram. I know what they do at West Melton. I think it's actually really dangerous, and I certainly don't want it happening where there are whole communities living around it.
Would it be possible to raise with Defence that whether they'd be willing to give up that designation? Because I mean, to give up aspects of it, given its proximity to residential. I mean, I just wonder whether we've actually thought about asking them whether they'd like, in the context of the district plan review, to review their the status of the designation. Because I mean, I've attended events there with the young trainees, but actually all of the particular military parades that I've watched there, they would be able to parade under our charter with the city anyway.
Got no problem with parades or
No, I
anything.
know,
It's just
I know.
the firearms in the middle of a residential community. No, they're not. Madam Chair, I have with me Sarah Oliver, who has held discussions with the Defence.
It was some years ago when we did the Southwest Area Plan. I had a number of conversations with the Defence Force. They do want to keep that designation. Whilst it does have a broad range of activities that they can use, predominantly their sort of strategic plan for the area just mainly indicated they'd be using it for more benign activities. But they indicated they would always keep their designation on it because it does give them that range of activities. Particularly, they did mention once that for civil defence purposes, if they ever needed to use it, that would be a good use because of its strategic location. But no, I mean, but the designation to get into that, I don't think they sort of indicated at that time they didn't have any desire to remove it.
And in fact, it's been confirmed in stage 1. It has already been notified. The Defence Force have said they want it rolled over.
Done deal.
Thank you.
So is there anything else that needs to be raised in that context? So that one's settled.
I remember in first one we have also asked for this question. If you use the specific purpose defense weapon instead of the specific purpose weapon airbase and museum, so museum, the name of museum no its name. But main function is still the museum activity or temporary convention center function essentially.
I don't know that you could say that the main function is the museum. The museum is one activity that takes place within that area.
Yes, but it's most important. But you need to use the new name, specific purpose defense weapon, instead of airbase and museum. When museum the name not.
No, they suggested to change it to Defence Wigram because it has a broader range than just the air base and the museum.
This is what the Defence Forces have asked for through the government, through the Minister's comments.
Yeah, I understand, but museum is more function. Hopefully the museum has the local function. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's all good. So that's that one's ticked off. All right, next one.
Okay, so the next one is looking at specific purpose zone tertiary on page 30. Just at the top of the, second box down from the top of the page.
I had this ticked off, but have I? No?
I just wanted to understand, sorry, because
Yep.
the island area seems to be quite interesting.
And I just want to understand what it actually meant could happen and couldn't happen. So sorry, just a...
Are we talking the item A about Siska Place or item B about Montana Ave?
both of them. So Montana Ave, as I understand it, is owned by the university except for one property.
That's right.
And is likely to be developed into accommodation for students.
Yes, and I
Yep.
did mention last time that that's possibly going to take a bit longer to happen than I had originally understood, but
Okay, I've got
it
no
is
problem with that.
already used for university purposes.
And the other one?
The other one was one property in Siska Place, which is also owned by the university, and my general rule here had been to, if a site is owned by and contiguous with the wider property, to give it the same zone. So that was why it was originally shown on the stage 2 planning maps as
Fine.
part
No
of the
problem.
wider university property. I then realised that actually that probably wasn't such a great idea if they suddenly decided, which they say they won't, to use it as an alternative service access to the hostels and, put heavy traffic through local residential streets.
Yeah.
So I took advantage of the fact that that was questioned by the Minister, not for that reason, but because it had changed from stage 1 to actually go with taking that back to residential.
Okay, thank you. And no other changes around the university?
No.
Okay, thank you very much.
That's great. So that's a tick.